Yes, folks, hello, welcome once again to MoDXtra Games and Collectibles. I'm Chris, this is my channel. Absolute pleasure to have you with me here. And a Happy New Year, folks. This is the first video I'm recording after a bit of a break over Christmas to see family and to drink lots of red wine and eat cheese and all that good stuff. And so this is the first of a small selection of videos that are kind of be focused on looking forward into the year that's coming. And one of the things I recently stated I'm most anticipating in 2026 is the Mattel takeover of the DC toy license, and specifically any adult action figure collectibles they may be producing. There's been some rumours, there's been some speculation, and of course there's some lessons I think Mattel can learn from McFarlane. So let's get into it and let's talk about the transition from McFarlane into Mattel. And the first item on the agenda, folks, is to talk about those rumours. So on December the 14th, Alex_Chen_Toy News posted this list of leaks. I don't know how reliable Alex Chen is. I do not know. There's certainly no statement in his comments here as to how he's corroborated it or where his sources are. And from what I understand at the moment in the toy industry, you've got to be a little bit careful when you're talking about leaks, apparently. But in any case, he speculated some interesting stuff. He said that there's a name change going to be taking place from DC Multiverse to DC Universe. And this is because the McFarlane license is running until the end of 2026. And they're going to be picking up and producing figures from mid-2026, which I'm not sure that's a good idea to have the two running parallel for a period of time. The rumour is that they're going to have a tiered system that they're going to be releasing according to their strategy they've had with WWE figures. So checks notes, they're going to start with kind of your budget-friendly standard figure first, and then perhaps move into more elite, more premium, more ultimate ranges. Then the release schedule is going to begin in July 2026 with a first wave that's made up of Batman, Robin, the Joker, and the Flash. Noting that those are going to be evergreen designs, so generic kind of classic look uniforms, one would assume, at 6.5-inch scale. And then a second wave coming in September 2026 with no characters named. Like I say, I don't know how true or not this is. It hit my radar because, well, as you can see from this Instagram screenshot, some folks that I follow on Instagram had shared it, and it kind of come my way. But I don't know, has Alex Chen released leaks of this nature before related to DC products that have been accurate? I've got nothing to judge that by. But it does interestingly speak to some of the lessons that I think Mattel should and could learn from the DC Multiverse from McFarlane and the period of time that we've had that. So let's talk a little bit about that, shall we? And on that front, the first thing I want to talk about is character variety. It would be fair to say, I don't think even, hardcore McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse fanboys could argue with this, that certainly in those earlier years, the line was just oversaturated with two particular members of the holy DC Trinity, and most specifically Batman, Superman being the secondary one. I went over onto Action Figure 411 and had a look at, the kind of first year releases in 2020. And there were 43 figures stroke multi-packs released in that year. 15 of them were Batmans, and 11 of them were Batman-adjacent characters like Batgirl, etc., Thomas Wayne, so on and so forth. And that kind of continued like throughout the entire line, just this obsession with different varieties of Batman, different varieties of Batman-adjacent characters, followed up by some Superman, like the Wonder Woman was ill-served. Some fun, perhaps more obscure fan fave characters were very ill-served. There were waves that were filled up with the crazy shit, like Jokerized version, the black and white version, all those kind of weird variants. And I think it would also be fair to say that the line was dominated by, so when they were selecting a kind of fan fave obscure design, it was a fan fave obscure design that appealed to the Todd McFarlane sensibilities. I've said before on live streams, felt like everything was sort of Spawnified. He was going for the characters that had spikes and chains and wore all black, and had that sort of that sort of McFarlane tone to them. Particularly, again, when it came to reissues of different Batman characters. Like if I look at a little note of a list that I made here, Unchained Superman, a Bronze Batman, Devastator Batman, the Drowned Batman, the Murder Machine Batman, Infected Shazam before we had a proper Shazam. McFarlane's own design of Wonder Woman, which was like this kind of dark warrior princess kind of thing. The Last Night on Earth Batman, the Speed Metal Flashes. I mean, the Speed Metal Flashes appeared in one issue of one kind of company-wide event. Now, that's not to say for 1 second that we can't acknowledge it's a tough game to play. And, Todd McFarlane and his team obviously kind of pitched their flag up on a particular approach and followed that particular approach with the kind of dark, spikier, more 90s style fucked up characters. There's no two ways about it. But it is a difficult game to play, and I think Mattel are going to have a look at DC Multiverse and have a very careful think about how they approach this, because the balance in the character roster is really, really important. The first thing you've got to acknowledge is the broad spectrum of DC-related fandom. I'm a 90s to early noughties DC Comics fanboy. So I want good, classic-looking 80s/90s characters with their, what I suppose would be considered their traditional classic look, spandex uniforms. That's what appeals to me, because that's my entry point. But later comic book fans might like the New 52 style and design. Earlier might want something that's a little bit more kind of golden age in feel and tone. And that's just the comic books. Then you've got fans of the animated series, like the Justice League Unlimited and the Batman animated series and Superman animated series, the DC animated universe with their mini movies that they release and the broad sort of variety of character designs, looks and feels in there. The movies, of course, all the way from like 89 Batman was enormously popular when McFarlane put that out. But you've got your classic 80s to 90s movies, you've got your Gunn universe, you've got your Snyderverse stuff, you've got the video games. Folks really love the Batman Arkham titles. So the balance of the character rosters is a really difficult route to navigate. And while I'm kind of encouraged by the rumor that they're going to be evergreen generic look uniforms, and that appeals to someone like me as a core kind of comic book fan, I think there's a very challenging tightrope that they're going to have to walk in a very careful way. I don't think Todd walked that tightrope well, to be clear. That's not to discourage anyone who believes that he did, but I don't think that he did. So character variety is an important lesson. This leak is encouraging for folks like me, but maybe less encouraging for others. Next on my list of talking points is sculpting detail. Now, when Todd got this right, he really got it right. Some of the sculpting detail in those figures are second to none. And while at times it did feel inconsistent, I've definitely got some characters in my admittedly smaller collection. I've been very selective and cherry-picked my DC Multiverse purchases. While I've got some in there where the sculpting has just really blown me away, like my Megafig Bane. I love that Megafig Bane. The early Lobo that I picked up. Oh, beautiful. The Aquaman with the scale design on his... brilliant. The sculpting details was just awesome. And also, I'm very appreciative of simple things, like when a boot is sculpted on. There's a boot line at the top of the boot, or gloves are sculpted on, or there's, armor pieces are, kind of sculpted into the figure design. And those statuesque designs, those lovely details that are inside the figures, I'm a little bit anxious about, a little bit concerned that Mattel might not quite bring that same quality, that if they take a bit more of a kind of Marvel Legends style ethos, which again, if we go back to that rumor from Alex Chen, if they're doing 6.5-inch scale, it means that, they're shooting for that Marvel Legends market. Well, Marvel Legends don't sculpt the boots on very often. They don't sculpt gloves on. Armor pieces, like Batman's bat symbol is often sculpted on a McFarlane figure, whereas with Marvel Legends, if they took a kind of Marvel Legends design ethos or what you might consider a traditional Mattel design ethos, would be painted on. Now, some might argue the sculpting detail was up and down, and I would say yes. I think that was mostly driven by kind of just inconsistent and strange decisions, kind of missed the mark decisions when it came to reuse. I think that's kind of one of the driving forces that caused that, but it was still like up there. And when I reviewed McFarlane figures, one of the things I did always lean into very heavily was the fact that I loved the sculpting detail, like the texture, creases in the clothing, the belting, even that standard sort of spandex superhero book. Just grabbed a couple here out of my collection that were using that standard superhero book, and the boot is sculpted on, the belt is sculpted on, which kind of solved part of the problem with the nappy look. Like the musculature, even in the standard sort of spandex look, you can see that musculature and sort of little clothing creases and stuff. Really, really nice. And when they got a head sculpt right, like that Hal Jordan one, I really love that Hal Jordan one. They really got it right. Although there were certainly times, sculpting detail-wise, where the head sculpt they didn't get right. Looking at this pasty Wonder Woman, who's not in focus, but nonetheless, you get the idea. So I think there's a legacy from DC Multiverse that Mattel have got to sit down and ask themselves questions around with regards to sculpting detail. I think if they kind of if they are perceived to go too far backwards in terms of the sculpting detail that is on offer with the new DC Universe line, if it is to be called that, then that will affect, fan interest, I'm certain of it. Next talking point on the list, scale consistency. Now, the rumor says 6.5 inch. That's fine. That's probably, I think Marvel Legends is roughly, 6 to 6.5, isn't it? So the fact that it'll scale well, or hopefully scale well with the Marvel Legends, that's a cool thing. But that's not actually what I'm talking about. Although the 7-inch size, I do find a little bit unwieldy at times, but that's not actually the issue. What I'm talking about is consistency character to character within the line. Todd and his team clearly did not give two shits about making sure that the sort of meta consistency of scale within the line itself sat right with the customers. And the best examples I can think of that I know were talked about a lot of the time was when there was sidekick characters. Batgirl, the Connell, Superboy, the Tim Drake, Robin, which I own. Some of the Megafig characters, sort of in terms of size compared to the characters you might want to display them with or use them with, didn't feel quite right. Like that John Constantine character. I think that's a good figure, actually. I like my John Constantine from McFarlane DC Multiverse, aside from a few small niggles, but I like it broadly enough. The aforementioned sculpting detail is lovely on it. But he seems really tall and lanky, and I'm just like, John Constantine's not as tall and buff as Batman or Superman. Do you know what I mean? It just doesn't feel right, and doesn't lean into the man-child play experience very well, I don't think, and affects the way you go about displaying your figures. I mean, let's have a look at that Tim Drake Robin I was talking about. So here is the Nightfall Batman, which you would think would be the figure you'd want to display and pair up with your Tim Drake Robin. But if I get Tim Drake Robin and drop him in here now, you can see the significantly different situation in terms of figure to figure scale. The height, the buffness of the Robin. And these are two figures that you would want to display together. If you're getting a little Nightfall theme going on, you want to chuck in your Catwoman in the mix as well, who incidentally is as tall as, if not slightly taller than both Robin and Batman. Throw in your Azrael at the back there, who I think probably with his armor would look a bit bigger, but you get the idea. Your little Nightfall display is just not quite feeling right in terms of the figure-to-figure scale. So scale consistency, and that kind of speaks to a larger thing around understanding how do your customers use their figures. And if it's an adult action figure collectible line, they've got to acknowledge that this is about displays, this is about dioramas, this is about photography. And when it comes to man-child playtime, we're looking for that type of consistency within the line. And I think Mattel have got to learn that lesson from DC Multiverse. My next talking point is articulation engineering. This one's probably going to get me run out of rail. Well, in fact, whenever I do a DC Multiverse video, I always get a few dislikes and a few snarky comments from the McFarlane fanboys. It's okay to like what you like, guys. I'm not criticizing you. Calm down. But I do think the articulation engineering on McFarlane was a letdown. I found it unwieldy. I found it difficult to achieve what I wanted to achieve with the figures. And if you look at my output on Instagram, I am taking many more photographs of the 6-inch lines from Hasbro, or lines like Fresh Monkey Fiction that I've kind of developed more of an interest in this year, than I am of the 7-inch multiverse stuff. I can't get them to where I want them to be. I think the articulation is ugly. I think it's awkward, and I think it follows a design philosophy that's about that kind of, it's a statuesque action figure, rather than an action figure with good sculpting. So it's designed I can tell it's designed to be sort of posed in that one particular posed way, or leaning into one particular posed way, and the articulation's not opening up the world of possibilities, not allowing the line to engage my imagination the way I wanted it to. If it did for you and you were able to work with the figures better than me, and it's, you know, it's an issue of my limits in imagination and my limits in patience, then I acknowledge that. I accept that. Don't, you know, like I say, it's not you I'm criticizing, folks, but I think Mattel have got to sit back and have a look at that articulation engineering, both in terms of DC Multiverse and learning a lesson from DC Multiverse, but also from having a little think about how articulation has moved forward, you know, in recent years. Like if they go straight in with a WWE style of design that sort of mirrors Marvel Legends, with things like the cut waist, the swivel waist, you know, rather than ball joints, or, you know, female figures that don't have butterfly joints, then you have to sort of step back and sort of say, what's going on there? You know, the figures are all still pinned. I know, again, for some that's, you know, a negligible point. And to me, to be honest, I'm not always that fussed about whether it's pinned or pinless, but technology has reached a point, and you know, engineering in these figures has reached a point now where pinless is a thing. So where's my money going? You know what I mean? You have to justify your price, and if there's lines that are able to produce nice, seamless, pinless looking figures with good arms and legs on them, then why are we still getting, you know? And also the McFarlane pins were big and ugly. I don't think anybody could deny that. That weird knee shape on the knees as well, you know, stuff like that. You have to make it a good looking figure in terms of the sculpting. But you also have to make it a good-looking figure in terms of the articulation and how the sculpting and the articulation interact. And I'm not sure McFarlane always hit the mark on that front. So articulation engineering, I think, is something that I'd like them to take a closer look at, and a lesson I'd want them to learn from DC Multiverse. Last one on the list now, folks, sales model. The McFarlane sales model. For me, again, I'm speaking for myself, and I'm not criticizing you as a fan of McFarlane. I'm criticizing my view of McFarlane, but the sales model was frustrating, very frustrating at times. In the first instance, popular character availability. Popular characters were incredibly hard to find sometimes. Now, I get that this is probably to do with supply and demand and sort of limited production runs or whatever. You know, McFarlane will have had reasons, although many have speculated that there's also a kind of FOMO scarcity marketing tactic at play there as well, which can't fully, you know, rule out either. But popular character availability was definitely a problem with the line. Certainly when McFarlane acquiesced and started producing more female characters, despite his borderline chauvinistic comments about female characters, they were extremely hard to get hold of. You know, the Wonder Woman, I know, is still a firmly sought after figure. The Power Girl figure, just, you know, difficult to get. I think people are right now struggling to hunt down the Zatanna that they want. But further to that, there was other complicating issues as well, like which in fact, all three of these illustrate, because they're all McFarlane collector's editions. In fact, that Hawkman, I believe, is a chase variant. So not only do you have kind of figure scarcity, popular character availability being an issue and people struggling to find what they want, and particularly over here, my view of that is probably even more tainted by the fact as a UK customer, I basically gave up. In the end, there were a number of characters that I wanted. I was just like, I just can't be bothered. They're not showing up in the independent retailers over here. I'd have to import them. The cost of import is just like doubling the cost. It's really hard. But then throw in the mix just this complicated sort of situation with the labels and the exclusives and the chases. You know, it's a gold label, it's a platinum edition, it's a platinum edition chase, it's a collector's edition, it's a what are the ones with the bloody digital assets with them? What were they called? You know, all these kind of different editions. They were with the comic book on the back. What was that one called? I can't even remember what it was called. But a great example of this was the Frank Quitely Batman and Robin. Batman was released mainline gold label, but the matching Robin was released as the one of the comic book figures from what is arguably the other line, even though they're both exactly the same articulation and pretty misscaled as well. And then putting some of the chase figures as the more desirable figures that were kind of behind the less desirable version of the figure. It just felt very cynical. You know, I know it's a company and they're seeking profit, and Mattel will very much probably more so than McFarlane, like ramp up the profit-driven activity. But I think Mattel have got to sit back and have a look at that McFarlane sales model and kind of consider how old-fashioned this sort of chase variance. I want a proper-looking standard Hawkman, and I don't want to have to chase through the new 52 variation before I can get the one I'm looking for. The Green Lantern Guy Gardner, if you're a 90s fan, you might be all right with the blue yellow ring version, but I want the core standard Green Lantern version. When I did finally get around to buying the Batman and Robin, Frank Quitely Robin, the Damian Wayne, I got some weird grey and black edition from an obscure run in his own title rather than the one I was looking for. It causes frustration, it causes confusion. It's not very acknowledging of the way that we purchase and collect now in any case. Your big box stores that are throwing these on shelves, aren't tailored to suit that type of chase anymore, especially because they focus a lot of their attention on movie tie-ins and stuff, or at least here in the UK they do. And we're ordering online, and that's a whole different game. And in fact, the whole setup, that very kind of 90s style chase collectors, different editions thing, it encouraged like really hardcore scalping activity, which always puts customers' teeth on edge. So I think Mattel have got to take a look at how confusing, how frustrating that sales model was with McFarlane at the times. Take a look at that kind of McFarlane customer sentiment. Even like really hardcore McFarlane fans were calling out and saying, "I'm sick of this chase bullshit." It was, and I'm a casual, so you can imagine how much it frustrated me. I think they've got to sit back and look at that, and particularly if that rumor is true, that they're starting with a kind of core line and then they'll look at Elite or Ultimate or whatever, that it's clean and it's easy to comprehend. And the lines between what a main line and what an ultimate is very, very clear, and that the price is appropriate, against all of that. Because that's the other thing with McFarlane. The quality of the figures was not improving. In fact, I feel like they were diminishing a bit in some of the more recent waves, but the price was creeping up with less added value. So there we go, folks. There's some thoughts around some lessons that Mattel can learn from DC, particularly off the back of those recent rumors. And again, I'll reiterate, because you've got to be careful about that sort of stuff nowadays when it comes to discussing leaks. I don't know how trustworthy, how accurate Alex Chen is. I think there may be some truth in it, or certainly if it's pure speculation, then I think is grounded in some reasonable kind of thinking. But nonetheless, the lessons I have discussed, I think, apply whether the rumors are true or not. And while it does feel like it's probably been a bit of a McFarlane bashing vid, it possibly has been a little bit because I've been very critical. I just want this new line to be as good as it can be. I'm hotly anticipating it. Those frustrations with things like the sale model, availability of popular characters, particularly internationally, was hugely frustrating for me. Or the fact that I couldn't quite play with my figures the way I wanted to because the scale figure to figure didn't feel right, or I couldn't quite engage with the articulation as deeply as I could with other lines that I love, like G.I. Joe Classified, for example. And that it didn't feel like it was modern enough, like it was still sort of living in a little bit of a backdated way. And I know all the arguments about, he's introduced, soft goods capes and all that. I get it. And, I'm not, I'm thankful for the improvements that did happen with the line. But the reality is that he's lost the license and that there is a new Mattel DC Universe line on the way. And I would really, really hope that Mattel have learned those lessons. So in any case, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. It's always a pleasure to have you guys here and hear what you've got to say. I'll wrap that one up there. Thanks for coming and hanging out. I hope you have a great day, and swing back around again for another video sometime soon. All right? Take it easy, folks.